All right. Thank you so much, Prof. Christy van Terstegen. And good afternoon, everyone, to the final session of the day, which is day 2. We have Professor William Gumede, who has joined us to provide a keynote address titled Mandela, Mbeki, and Zuma, Constructing Approaches to Nation. But before I begin introducing him, my name is Pedro. The surname is Mzileni. I'm currently based in the international office at Nelson Mandela University, and I'll be your facilitator this evening. The session has been allocated an hour and 15 minutes, so we'll have 45 minutes of the keynote address by Professor Gumede, and then we'll have 30 minutes afterwards for a conversation. Please use the Q&A function on the right-hand side of the box, and then when the time comes for a conversation, I will read out the questions and comments from the box to Prof. Gumede. So Prof. William Gumede is an associate professor of political economy in the School of Governance at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He is the founder and executive chairperson of the Democracy Works Foundation, which is now currently based in 8 countries. Previously, he has worked as the program director for the Africa-Asia Center at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He was also a course leader at the School of Public Policy in the Central European University in Budapest. He was also a senior associate member and Oppenheimer Fellow at St. Anthony's College in Oxford University. Professor William Gumede has also been a senior research fellow and graduate student mentor at the London School of Economics and Political Science, which is the LSE. He was also a former member of the editorial panel for the Post-Global Washington Post newspaper and Newsweek, which is based in Washington, D.C. And also with us in South Africa, he was also the former deputy editor of the Sowetan newspaper. Professor William Gumede has won a number of South African and international awards for activism, journalism, and writing, including the South African Courageous Journalism Award in 1995, the British Diageo Award for Excellence in Reporting on Africa for the work in Nigeria. This was in 2005, and he was also awarded a special commendation by UNESCO. He is the author of a couple of #1 bestsellers, with his most recent book titled South Africa in BRICS, published by Tafelberg. The profile goes on, colleagues. I do not want to waste any more time, but rather to invite Professor William Gumede to the floor to give us a keynote address titled Mandela, Mbeki, and Zuma, Contrasting Approaches to Nation Building. Prof, lovely to have you with us this afternoon. I invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very grateful that you've invited me. I'm very happy, I'm very excited to speak to you. Also, I mean, following on, the great Professor Mahmoud Mandani, a real big hero of mine and also of my generation, the man who really is at the top of his game, one of the leading African intellectuals, and one also who has done a lot for people from my generation, in South Africa, who began just immediately after 1994 to start looking at academia as an option. And he brought many people, particularly in my own circles, started off in the late 1980s and the early 90s to Gumede University, and I almost also went there, but for the fact that I had a really big interest in India, in the Indian Congress Party, and in Japan, and the recovery of Japan, and in Singapore and Malaysia. So I took a little bit of a different route, but it was a very inspiring lecture. So I'm very excited to follow on his inspiring lecture. Now, for me, the important thing is in terms of, how do we reimagine identity, and how do we reimagine, I think, democracy? Because currently, not only in South Africa, across Africa, but across the world, democracy is facing challenges. There's opposition to democracy. How do we reimagine something new? It fits very much in my space. In 2013, I set up Democracy Works Foundation, and essentially why I set it up was to defend democracy and to try to begin to think with others of how do we put new content and new energy into democracy on the African continent. But it also fits into another interest of mine. A couple of years ago, I set up PLAV in Senegal to defend democracy defenders across Africa who often would disappear, unknown, repressed, or sent to jail by many of the autocrats on the continent. And the idea really is to defend, hopefully in every nook and cranny, to defend a democracy defender across the continent so that people won't disappear and people won't remain voiceless. Because of that, I'm very, very grateful that I can talk to you. I think let me get to what I want to talk to you, and it actually fits very neatly, dovetails very neatly into Mahmoud Mandani's conversation yesterday. Really, is my thing is, how do we foster a common South Africanness? How do we build an inclusive citizenship? Because these two things, not only in South Africa, but also since the end of the Second World War in Africa, the inability to create inclusive citizenship along ethnic and race lines really have caused many of the terrifying conflicts on the continent. And the second one is also really the battle for democracy on the continent since the end of colonialism has also been an issue where we've seen across the continent there's been big arguments against democracy since the beginning of independence. Some African leaders argued that democracy is a luxury, of course, and of course they failed when they pursued alternatives to democracy. Others were, said that democracy is a luxury. Now again, they failed, and the interesting part of it is the countries in Africa, between 54, 55, depending on how you count the countries in Africa. Those who genuinely try democracy actually have done better over the last 4 or 5 decades than the others who rejected it based on either that democracy is a foreign concept, or either that democracy is a luxury, or either that development must go first. So let me get down to the business of the day. I think for me to start off to say that South Africa's bitter history of more than 350 years of colonialism and apartheid, with its accompanied ethnic divisions, racial divisions, conflict, and state-sponsored economic inequalities, makes the challenge of cobbling together a new South Africanness, a common South Africanness from our divided past, so much harder, yet so much more urgent. I mean, to start with, diverse developing countries such as South Africa, with such political divided past, obviously cannot find a solution in nationalism based on shared culture or common citizenship or living in a shared space alone. So that's too narrow. So we'll have to imagine beyond that, beyond what is traditionally assumed to create a common identity. And as I said earlier on, I mean, really the difficulties of many African liberation movements and independence movements since coming to power is they have struggled to construct a citizenship as an inclusive concept, given the fact of the past of colonialism, ethnic divisions, and economic inequalities. But that's the challenge of our generation. How can we imagine something different? Now, to start off with, I would want to make an argument that there is no one single definition of who is African. For me, that's absolutely crucial. And there is no one single definition of who is South African. Really, that for me is the starting point. Now, the obvious building point is identifying oneself as South African. That's what, that's really the pillar. But the definition of being South African cannot be narrow, but it has to be inclusive and it has to be embracing. And very importantly for me, it has to be democratic. Now, the ethnic and the language and the regional diversity bequeathed by both colonialism and apartheid must mean that a modern South Africanness cannot be but a layered identity, interwoven, and it's a mosaic identity. And being African, secondly for me, cannot ever take only one form. It cannot just be based on one's pigmentation. It cannot just be on one's language. It cannot just be on one's struggle credentials. It has to be more nuanced. It has to be multiple, and it has to be diverse. Now, alarmingly for me, increasingly in South Africa, many South Africans do perceive what is African or South African in our context is very narrow, either only based on one type of pigmentation, one type of ethnicity, or one's forebears, or one's level of suffering. That's just not good enough. And this, of course, leads to the misguided phenomenon that some people are perceived as supposedly not African enough, or not Black enough, or not South African enough. Now, the interesting thing, of course, about South African colonialization, and maybe there I would differ a little bit with Mahmoud Mandani, is that our colonization was, of course, not like it was in Nigeria or Ghana, but it was a colonization, what has been described, of course, in the past as the New World type of colonialization, different type to many colonizations experienced by other African countries. Now, before colonization, countries like South Africa were inhabited by indigenous peoples prior to colonialization. And of course, colonialization brought settlers from other countries. But in many cases, also it brought subjected peoples from other parts of the world. Just think about it in the South African context, whether from India or whether from Malaysia, whether slaves or whether subjects. Now, our kinds of societies over time became ethnically culturally, and pigmentally very mixed. Even the indigenous communities present before colonialism often were mixed at one level or the other. I mean, this would mean then that an African identity in our context is therefore more diverse. And that is also, for me, the strength, that uniqueness, that diversity should be the strength of our identity, the basis of our national identity, the mirror to ourselves and our face to the world. That for me is a fundamental pillar of Africanness in the South African context, or South Africanness in the South African context. Now, on the face of it again, one might think that, look, because of the long colonization and because of apartheid, that all of the different communities within South Africa are separate communities. We are not. We are not gated communities. We often overlap very meaningfully. As I said earlier on, we are layered. And for me, the most important thing is we are interconnected. And almost that it would mean that our Africanness and our South Africanness must be based on interconnected differences. For me, that's the second really important pillar of common South Africanness. Almost a bit like in India, the both colonial and the apartheid governments, of course, have insisted that South Africa is a society of self-enforced communities, always potentially, and in the absence, supposedly, of the colonial or the apartheid state, in gruesome potential conflict with one another. But I would argue that is not the case. So we are interconnected, and we have to look at it from a view of interconnected differences. Now, the challenges for us in South Africa is how do we build our common citizenship around that interconnected differences. It would mean that a common identity then will have to be built on the mosaic of the best elements of our diverse past and our present, and our histories and our cultures. And accepting that diversity is going to be really important for us. It's going to be important for us from a development point of view. It's going to be important to us from a growth point of view. It's going to be important for us from a peace point of view. From a societal peace point of view, we are not going to be peaceful as a society unless we embrace that. Now, of course, sadly, many South Africans do think, or many do fear, whether on an ethnic basis or language basis or color basis, fear embracing the interconnected differences of others. They fear that it may erode their own ethnic, cultural, or language identity. They are wrong. The third pillar then in our setup, if we want to reimagine a common South Africanness and a common Africanness, for me, is a common identity based on democracy. So, I repeat. a common identity based on democracy. And the challenge here really is for a country to try to build a common identity on democracy, essentially to build a common identity, to build it on politics. Of course, it's not easy. It's hard. It needs imagination. It needs a different way of thinking. And if you want to use this politics to build a common identity, a common South Africanness, it is not going to come by decree or by good intentions. Our founding myths, a big part of it, is based on politics. The fact that a country managed, out of the ashes of a potential civil war, to construct a democratic dispensation, new constitution, embrace our diversity, new set of democratic values, rules, and political culture. That's our setup. It's a big part of our political identity. As I say, it's not easy, but I'll come to it. Why is it difficult? Or why it is also very urgent that we build it. So it's going to be very important for us that our self-identities, the way in which we identify ourselves, must be based on the common constitution, on a democracy, on the democratic institutions, and on the democratic values. So the best way forward for us in South Africa is not African nationalism, Afrikaner nationalism, or any other kind of nationalism. It's almost a civic nationalism, as Mikhail Ignatieff described before. The glue that must hold us together, our identity must be based on rights, shared democratic culture, values, and institution, not on ethnic nationalism, whether it is isiZulu, Indian, or Afrikaner, or colored, or whatever other identity. Now, because this is a political construct, it's obviously, there are many pitfalls. And it's not an easy part, but it's a part I think we must embrace with energy and with imagination. Now, if we're going to build a common identity, part of our common identity, on a political construct, it would mean that we need accountable democratic states. If you don't have accountable democratic states, that nation building efforts will fail, and it will fail spectacularly. We've seen it in the struggles. We are entering a moment in the country where people are retreating into ethnic lagers, cultural lagers, language lagers, nativism, because a big part of that is because of the failure of the state. Democratic states are absolutely crucial in building that new common South Africanness. A workable, a credible democratic state, which is premised, of course, on being effective, being inclusive, and being caring. Now, a combination of lack of service delivery, state failure, and the perception that only a few people are benefiting from the post-1994 end of apartheid, where he's a small elite of blacks, where he's the old white elite, of course, undermine the state's ability to be the binding agent of a common identity. Now, the second part of this of using the political construct to build a common identity would be, or third rather, is that leadership is going to matter. And that is, I think in the last 10 minutes of my presentation, I'll come to the leadership a little bit more. But to say that good public leadership is going to be a pillar of fostering that common South Africanness. So we're going to get terrible leaders. We're going to have corrupt leaders. We're going to have populistic leaders. We're going to have opportunistic leaders. It will undermine all of our efforts to build that common South Africanness, that common identity. That is why, Nelson Mandela, when he was president, for him, it was very important that he, through his own personality, he tried to become a symbol of a common South Africanhood. I was asked to do the introduction to Mandela's No Easy Walk to Freedom. And I remembered, and I thought, I was from such a different generation than Mandela, and I have had such an uneasy relationship with Mandela, both when I was in sort of student movement, but also when I was as a Sowetan newspaper. And I wondered how one would do an introduction or a new introduction, a post sort of 94 introduction to No Easy Walk to Freedom. But one thing stood out for me about Mandela. What he tried to do really in almost every action when he was president is to, through his leadership, really become a symbol for all South Africans. So he wanted to lead and to become a leader for all South Africans. Not only a leader for the ANC or a leader for blacks, but a leader for all South Africans. And of course, that early on for my generation, we didn't really like that. Because we wanted Mandela to be a leader for blacks and so on. Because Mandela understood that building this common identity through politics, it is going to be very important that the political leadership in South Africa rise above ethnicity, color, language, region, and political party when they lead. For me, the fourth pillar then will have to be given our past, the inequalities of our past and the inequalities of our present. That we have a social solidarity, social justice, and caring for the vulnerable that goes across class, across race, and across region. It's going to be very important to get a buy-in into a political construct of South Africanness and Africanness. Now, what I want to do the last 10 minutes, I want to take you to have a look at what Mandela's leadership. Go back to Mbeki. It's been a long time since I've looked at Mbeki's leadership. The last time I looked at it, of course, it was almost career-threatening. I barely survived that. Well, I think I'll just summarize sort of this part of my conversation. Just to say the very first thing about a common South Africanness and a common Africanness has to be layered. It has to be built on interconnected differences. We have to move away from focusing on individual self-identity based on very narrow means, whether it's color, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's language. We have to look at it much more inclusively. We should have accountable democratic state. We should have caring, social justice, and a solidarity that goes across class, across race, and across color. My last 10 minutes. Okay. The Mandela Leadership. Now, I mean, for me, the leadership of Mandela stood out from a democratic point of view. Because you have to understand where, Mandela's generation, where he started off in the 1950s, late 1940s. If you look at him, the milieu and the environment, the African environment of that time, the liberation movements and the African, let's call it African liberation ideology, which goes, of course, across Africa. Democracy really was not an important thing for that generation. It was liberation and it was independence, it was freedom. Freedom and independence and liberation did not mean democracy for that generation, the generation of Julius Nyerere, Nkrumah, and so on, 1950s, 1960s. That is sort of the generation that Mandela fitted in. So it was pretty extraordinary for me. And again, when I went through a manuscript of his No Easy Walks of Freedom, that he had already talked in the 1950s about democracy, democratic institutions, and so on. So I say it was extraordinary because liberation, freedom, and independence at the time did not include democracy for that generation. Now, Mandela's historic leadership contribution, of course, what he needed to do, and he was very aware of it, he needed to cobble together a consent, a broad-based consent for the new democracy and the democratic order. It was very important for him. And you must also think, now if you go back, period 94, first 3 years, and unfortunately still with us, is democracy in South Africa has been and is still contested. There are alternative governance systems up to now, even more forcefully, even now also, they compete against democracy. I mean, Mahmoud Mandani yesterday talked about customary law. Now, that's in competition to democracy, to the democratic constitution. Now, we've got other competitors, alternative governance systems to our constitution. If you live in some parts of South Africa, you would live under the governance system of gangs, their rules, their laws, where the South African constitution is far removed from people's daily reality. Now, of course, if you want to build a common identity, a common South Africanness, and a common Africanness, a democratic state and a constitution we cannot have contesting governance systems. We either have to reject customary law institutions, or we have to reform it to make it align with a democratic constitution and with a democratic system. Otherwise, we'll never get that identity based on democracy. And Mandela was absolutely aware of that. And of course, Mandela again, he brought an issue maybe, for me, the one fundamental failure of the Mandela presidency. And of course, I'm a bit harsh, is that negotiated deal to make the 1994 election happen, where it was decided to retain essentially the Bantustans. Of course, under the boats in KwaZulu-Natal, and also in parts of the country, Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, where essentially the traditional systems remained as part of the deal to get us the 27 April 1994 elections. Let me get back onto Mandela. So what Mandela tried to do, he tried to show that he wasn't above the law. He deferred to the Constitution and he deferred to the law to entrench the law and the Constitution. Submitted himself to the courts. He humbled himself in front of the courts. He went out of his way, of course, to show respect for the parliamentary opposition parties, even if they may be tiny. What he wanted to show was that an identity around democracy must include dissent, and it must include difference, political difference, or any other kind of difference. He made a point of being seen to strengthen the authority of Parliament. He appeared regularly before Parliament. He deferred to Parliament on a very regular basis. He brought in, of course, the parliamentary opposition. What he did, he set up an opposition forum in Parliament where he would be on a very regular basis, sit down with him, discuss policies, and so on, which meant that in Parliament, the opposition parties were less hostile to him. But Mandela went out of his way also to create a culture of openness, honesty, and ways possible to dissent, to be different from his views, from the party views, cultural views, social views. And he went out of his way, of course, to bring in the opposition, to bring in others who were different politically, ethnically, colorly, pigmentationally, bring them into cabinet, because it's government of national unity. Mandela's non-racialism. Now, Mandela was a proponent of the term coined by Archbishop Desmond Tutu of the Rainbow Nation. And of course now, we criticize sometimes the rainbow nation concept. Maybe it's a little bit flaky, and so on. But for Mandela, it was important. Diversity and differences was important. And for him, really that was an important mantra for him. And he also saw himself as sort of the bridgehead between the old and the new. And I mean, it's interesting. I'm going to quote you what Mandela said at Potch in February 1996. Quote, start of the quote. I will pass through this world but once, Mandela said. And I do not want to be diverted from my main task, which is to unite the nation across racial lines. Mandela continued, I'm writing my own testament because I'm nearing my end. I want to be able to sleep till eternity with a broad smile on my face, knowing that the youth, opinion makers, and everybody is stretching across the divide, trying to unite the nation. Well, I've got 5 minutes left, and I'm going to divide my 5 minutes between Mbeki and Zuma. Maybe I should have given Zuma a little bit more time, and Mbeki a little bit more time. Now, Mbeki saw his leadership in the context of nation building as to rearrange the post-apartheid political stage after Mandela. So where Mandela was to get us used to the new, to this interconnected differences, my view, it was Mbeki, the way he looked at nation building was now to try to consolidate. Now, of course, it is, we've got a lot of questions around whether he was successful and in a way that he went about. So while while Mbeki still pursued the Mandela line, his emphasis was a little bit more on transforming the apartheid economy and bringing blacks into the mainstream economy. So his focus shifted very much to that, and very much less on the reconciliation side, and very much less on building the democracy side. And Mbeki made it very clear that white South Africans in this new democratic social contract have social justice obligations to the previously disadvantaged communities. Mbeki's presidential style was that of a philosopher king. What they do is they set out their policies as authoritative pronouncements. It carries the weight and the legitimacy of the highest office in the country. Now, of course, the weakness of that type of philosophy king type of leadership is what it does. It limits and it stifles public debate and engagement because it means the leadership has spoken and no one else should say anything else. Or no one else's voice is legitimate after the leader has spoken. And of course, there has also been the philosophy king leaders like Nyerere, Kahunda, and Nkrumah, and so on. Mbeki also wasn't inclusive enough. which then meant that there's no consensus enough, which means a lot of South Africans felt outside this project, this great project of democracy building, state building, of common identity building. Whereas, of course, Mandela brought in many people in with his business, with his opposition parties. Together, big tent, Mbeki had a smaller tent, excluded many people, undermined democratic state building project, reconciliation project, undermined, of course, the common South African identity project. Now, Mbeki's Non-Racialism. Mbeki did try in, in his second term. What he tried to do, which I thought was a very good thing. It didn't work out. He did try to build a centrist consensus, where he tried to build a common South Africanism around almost a social pact of bringing in some of the opposition parties, bringing in some business, and trying to build a social pact around an economic development project. Of course, that didn't work out. For 2 minutes, I think, Zuma presidency. I think most of the questions can come from the Zuma presidency. Populist presidents, I think that's the first thing. Now, populism, of course, most post-independence liberation movements, ZANU-PF, etc., were populist movements of the left. Now, the populist project has failed, as far as I'm concerned, since the Second World War in Africa, to create common identities across the countries where they were in control. Now, what Zuma did, he bent democratic institutions to his will, which meant he undermined the pillar of their common South African-ness. His presidency also was based on the idea of being a traditional chief. I'm going to quote you, and it tells you a lot. It tells you a lot about Zuma. In 2016, he gave a talk in Tembisa, at a primary school, Tembisa. And I'm going to quote, he said, "If you just give me 6 months to be a dictator, things will be set straight. Right now, to make a decision, you need a resolution, you need a collective, you need a petition. It's a lot of hard work. I want to be a dictator." He said it, of course, jokingly, but that really is how he governed. And then related to that, governance as a traditional chief. Now, the way traditional chief governed is that the office of the presidency was used to distribute patronage to friends and to family, of course, almost as a head of a traditional court. Government property, public property becomes communal property with the chief in control at his behest. Of course, in our context, we've seen how the traditional systems where the communal property, communal land has become was the fiefdom of traditional chiefs and kings. Now, in a similar vein, the Zuma presidency, the state has become a personal fiefdom of his presidency. Now, I'm going to enter here Zuma's ethnic mobilization, which undermined their common South Africanism. Zuma based his ANC presidency campaign at apartheid's 2007 Polokwane conference on portraying the opposition to his bid to become the president of the ANC at the time, as a conspiracy as against a Zulu speaker becoming president of the country. Now that, of course, really undermined the whole idea of much more inclusive Africanness and South Africanness. And of course, Zuma, ending of year, supported and really pushed the traditional court bill, which, and I will quote, and I will conclude under quote, the activist Patrick Masego, in his 2008 submission to Parliament about a traditional court bill, he said, if that bill would be adopted, it would, instead of making rural people equal citizens in a unitary South Africa, make them subjects of chiefs who are given the coercive power to get rid of those who try to hold them to account. I leave you there. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I've gone over a few minutes over the time, open to questions, particularly questions about Jacob Zuma. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Prof. Gumede, for the insightful keynote address. I'll go straight to the list of questions that are right here on the chat box for you. And I'll maybe just as the first round, read maybe the first three, and then you maybe respond to them, and then I'll come back with the others as they come through. So the first question is, can you hear me, Prof? Am I audible on the side?
I can hear you clearly. Thank you. Yes, sir.
All right, lovely. So the first question is, it seems that economic inequalities remain defined in clear racial and class lines. The common identity, which is the one you speak of, around democracy seems to have been failing daily in bringing the working class into any livable quality of life. The governance system must always be judged by the actual improved quality of life of the majority as the common good. So that is the first one. And the second one is around the same theme. It says, thanks for the insightful keynote address, Prof. However, don't you think requiring social justice across race and class in South Africa is aspirational, yet reality on the ground points to a growing resilience of race and class that create tension in society? How can these divisions be addressed on the ground? I think maybe if you could respond to those two, then I'll come back with the rest on the following segment. Sure.
No, absolutely. I do agree that the continued inequalities make it very difficult to build a common identity. Unfortunately, the model, the economic model to deal with those inequalities in the post-1994 period was, of course, I think we did not learn lessons from elsewhere to come up with a different economic model, and it got us stuck where we are. And then, of course, in the 9 years of Jacob Zuma, we deteriorated further. So, parallel to these, what we're doing and what other Africans have done since the Second World War, some of the countries in Southeast Asia have taken a different path where they build their national identity project really specifically on dealing with economic inequalities and are building their economies So that's a totally different part. So the idea of building it through an economic miracle, and an economic miracle that include as many people in the benefits. Now, what we've done in 1994, what the ANC done rather, has been to, our transformation model from an economic point of view has gone wrong, and has actually helped along increase the inequalities. The first thing was, I would argue, the Black economic empowerment was absolutely the wrong policy. And I know, even myself, 94, 95, was very excited. At the time, 94, I worked for COSATU, and there were a lot of delegations that went to Malaysia at the time to have a look at the Malaysian model of economic empowerment to try to bring in, the disadvantage in order to build their common identity, post-colonial identity on economic redress. Now, by the time really we learned about that Black economic empowerment model of Malaysia, of course, that model had been an absolute crisis. And of course, we didn't look at, by the early 90s, by the late 1980s, the Malaysian model was in a crisis. So we went to have a look at that model and adopt a big part of that model without critically looking at it. So what we should have done, so we'd rather be more positive, because I have talked a lot and written a lot about what we did wrong, but maybe to say what we could and what we've done wrong and what we could still do. I think what we've done wrong has been to pursue a policy of a Black economic empowerment to try to create Black tycoons along the lines of sort of the Black, almost to create Black Oppenheimers, Black Ruperts, and so on, rather than going perhaps the Singapore way, or the South Korean way, or the Taiwan way of actually using that same money to our disposal. Because just making calculations of a handkerchief, we mostly spent since 1994 on Black economic empowerment, most probably over $1 trillion rand has been spent on Black economic empowerment. And if you look at the people, I can tell you honestly, under 100 people benefited from Black economic empowerment. So if we've taken that money, and if we then had distributed that money into really small Black businesses and so on, it would have done. I think it would have been totally different if we taken that money and uplifted Black public education and so on. So if we had said, instead of companies giving BE deals to politically connected ANC people, just to say that a company has to sponsor a school or sponsor a state, a town, like Tata would sponsor a town, or Mitsubishi in Japan would sponsor a whole town. When I say sponsor a town, build the infrastructure, finance the schools, pay the teachers, and so on. So these are alternative models. And sadly, we did not look at those models who were absolutely successful. And we would have dealt with inequality different. And that's a problem. And I, of course, also, people like me who covered, initially worked for COSATU and then immediately got into journalism for the first 5 years after 1994, did not look and did not talk actually what has happened. Alternative economic transformation models that have been very successful in other parts of the world. I remember in 1995, or 1993, there was a World Bank came up with the economic miracle report, which was sponsored by Japan. And the idea what Japan wanted to do is Japan wanted to show that after the end of the Cold War, there were an alternative economic transformation model available. And they also came to South Africa, of course, they spoke to the ANC, and the ANC, of course, rejected it. Which was, of course, very sad. So for me, it is our inequalities after 1994. Of course, apartheid is to blame for it, but for me, it has been we've shot ourselves in the foot. We're responsible for quite a big part of the opportunities that we could have made turn around with inequality. I mean, possibly there may be an opening after the looting that happened. I think possibly the crisis now, the financial crisis that we are in after COVID-19, and now also after the looting, may perhaps open an opportunity maybe for a new social contract where we could begin to reimagine all of society approach to deal with our inequalities, which would involve not only the ANC and not only the state, but it would involve business, civil society, citizens, professional organizations, universities, and so on. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Prof. Let me carry on to read the next segment of questions on the chat box for you. So this one is more of a comment. It says, I had a question about the place for plurality in the pursuit of common identity, but I think these comments on enabling dissent and opposition are serving that question. And then the next one, okay, this one goes to the aspect you were closing on Zuma. It says, what do you think is the main appeal about Zuma during and post his presidency? Basically, I want to understand the basis of the kind of support that he continues to enjoy in South Africa. And then next one, it says, very insightful, Prof. Matter. To what extent would you say Duduzane Zuma's aspirant presidency impacts the potential of nation building? And then maybe the last one for this segment would be, thank you for the insightful comparison, Prof. Gumede. What would you say on President Ramaphosa's approach? Although this may be a premature question if one takes the COVID-19 challenges into account. Yeah, those are the questions for this segment, and then maybe we'll have the final segment afterwards. Sure.
No, absolutely. I mean, just to start off with dissent, I mean, I'll take you back to the Mandela presidency. And Mandela was very much open to dissent, even dissent within the ANC. And that did not undermine his leadership. In fact, that strengthened his leadership, and that strengthened him as a leader. And that also society, if you think about a period between 94 and 98, the Mandela presidency, because we had that openness to dissent, to rebel, and to attack Mandela. I mean, people like me attack Mandela on such a regular basis at the time. And of course, you know, Mandela was still a man of his time, where, you know, if you're a youth, they still sometimes wanted a little bit respect. But he was often puzzled by, you know, the kind of frontal criticism. But I mean, the openness of that really, what it meant is it opened, you know, it opened the energy of people. It, you know, it brought people closer to Mandela, to the democratic project. It wanted people to become involved, to be part of it, to buy in. And it also helped, of course, refine Mandela's project, because the criticism, taking it on board, refined his own project. Because if you don't get it and you only live in your own world, like many African leaders, you know, push aside dissent, alternative opinion, you know, you don't get the better ideas, the quality ideas, and you don't get, of course, the buy-in for a democratic project, for common citizenship project, or for economic transformation project, and you don't get the energy, you don't get a hope, because when you build, as a country, countries also need energy, good energy, in order to, you know, to bring people along on nation building project, democracy building project, and on an economic transformation project. Appeal of Jacob Zuma. I think, and I have been thinking about it myself, why does he have appeal? So when I guess, I think maybe the first thing is that people, I think, do not understand, or rather do not see the significance of the cost of corruption. Think about it, of that 9 years of the Zuma presidency. If we calculate between 3 and 4 trillion rands have been wasted, either corruptly, either mismanaged, disappeared. Now you think about it, 9 years. South Africa's budget for a big part of those 9 years was just over, annual budgets over R1 trillion. So it just means that a third of the money during the 9 years of Zuma's presidency just disappeared, gone. What does it mean for development? Think about it, 3 to 4 trillion rand, and so on. So people don't see the impact of what it means. So that's just one calculation. If you want then do a different way of looking at it, of people who were deterred, seeing all the stuff that's going on around Zuma, and didn't want to participate, whereas don't want to participate, bring in their capital, they want to bring in their ideas, they don't want to bring in their skills, they want to bring in their businesses and so on. That type of money loss, we could potentially make a calculation, maybe it's a similar 3-4 trillion rand. So there are lost opportunities. Then again, we can even make another calculation. We could say, well, if you're going to have cadre deployment where you just appoint your friends, your family, your people, and they are incompetent and incorrupt, and you have 60, 70%, 80% of state-owned entities failing, the state failing, the missed opportunities, the opportunity costs of that. So I think there's a very poor understanding for that. But it's not only in South Africa, of course, it's been across post-colonial history. Just think of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. There were people supporting him to the hilt, despite the fact that it is against their own interests. If you are poor, it would be against your own interests to support a Jacob Zuma, or even Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, or even Uganda to support Yoweri Museveni or Idi Amin. It's not in your interest because whatever they do, you're going to feel it in your pocket. You're not going to have a house. You're not going to have a job. You're not going to have education, and so on and so on. And the future also has been destroyed. I mean, that really is for me the second thing in terms of really, in my sense, some of the things that we have to think a little bit more creative around is in terms of to the extent of how people who have been formerly oppressed and coming out of trauma often support leaders and vote for leaders that goes against their own interests. What trauma means in terms of how we make decisions, not only at a political level, but also decisions where it's in our intimate space, where it's decisions in our businesses, where it's decisions in our communities. And the thing is, of course, about trauma that research out of places like Israel and so on is coming. The trauma of colonialism, of course, and trauma of apartheid, it goes in generations. It goes 3, 4 generations, and some people, 4th, 3rd generations after the Holocaust, for example, still behaves, although they didn't experience it, as if, they dare, and the parents, make decisions in their context. I think we can make the argument in the same way in post-colonial Africa, post-apartheid, the kind of decision-making where we vote for political parties, for individuals, like a Jacob Zuma, like a Robert Mugabe, and it goes against our own interests. And maybe we have to start beginning to unpack how do we change that trajectory? Because if we don't just change that trajectory, we're going to be in a path which is a self-destruct path. We will get and vote for leaders, more and more leaders like that, like in many other African countries, and it would mean another generation again will vote for leaders like that. Maybe the Julius Malemas are coming, who are really in the same mold, and so on. So that's really most probably from an intellectual's point of view, from civil society point of view, really it is something that we have to engage with. Even our psychologists will have to engage with it. And in a way, most probably, I mean, I was not a supporter of Steve Biko because I came through the South African Communist Party and so on. I'm not there, of course, anymore. But I think the importance of what Steve Biko tried to say, and of course, not only him, but also Fanon and Albert Memmi in Tunisia. I mean, their arguments initially in the 1960s and then, of course, the 1970s of Steve Biko was really on this. Most probably, they didn't say that, but I am interpreting it on their behalf. What they would have most probably meant was that we're really from a how do we change trauma-based societies to begin to make decisions more consciously and begin to elect leaders more consciously. And maybe secondly, maybe our kinds of societies most probably may need different kinds of leaderships. We may need, we'll have to get more caring leaders, perhaps not the kinds of leaders that we would think a strong, the traditional way that people look at strong leadership. But we have to look at caring and compassionate and empathic leaders as strong, which of course in the African context, when you come from a liberation struggle, when you come from a colonial struggle, people look at leadership. Strong leadership becomes, the military, the rhetoric, the populism, the way you talk against the colonialism, the way you talk against white minority regimes, your rhetoric, that becomes strong. Your supposed radicalism, your rhetoric. But maybe we have to start beginning to look at different kinds of leadership, different kind of strong. The strong that is caring, the strong that is compassionate, the strong that is inclusive. I don't know how we're going to get that. But that maybe is not only for South Africa, but also in the African context, a different way, a different look at what it means to be strong. Ramaphosa, I was just say early days. You can say early days. I think, I mean, there's been so many missed opportunities from a Ramaphosa point of view. He's been there 3 years. I think he's offered very little as a blueprint. I mean, he really hasn't worked on strengthening the democratic institutions. He has chosen the ANC above the public interest, above the citizens. That immediately, of course, undermined a common nationalism when you support the ANC and you don't support the South African project beyond the ANC. That absolutely, of course, has undermined. Also, hasn't so far sold the political world to deal with corruption at the same time. For me, it hasn't been inclusive enough. He promised a lot because he was close to Mandela. So, of course, there was a lot of expectations of the promise, almost the unfulfilled promise of Mandela, the caringness, being caring, compassionate, solidarity. Of course, he hasn't delivered on that, hasn't delivered on the democratic state. He hasn't delivered on the inclusivity. He has governed in the interest of the ANC rather than in the interest of all South Africans. So really, unfortunately, I think history is going to judge him very harshly. History may judge him as harshly as history will judge Jacob Zuma. And unfortunately, also, if he goes on this route, he may not be even re-elected again in the ANC, but also he may, or even if he gets re-elected in the ANC because he's been focusing on the interests of the ANC in order to get re-elected, the ANC may not get elected in the next election. So then all of his efforts to try to focus on the ANC first and not South Africa first means he may win the ANC, but he may not win the South African presidency in the next elections.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. I'm looking at the time, and we've actually come to the exact period where we are supposed to wrap up the program for for day 2, it is exactly 15 minutes past 6. I just want to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon and also throughout the day. The program continues tomorrow, of course, as we move to day 3. I want to take this opportunity to thank Professor William Gumede for the input once again, and I wish everyone a very good and a safe evening. See you tomorrow at 8:45 for day 3. Night.
Thank you.